peasants waited until the soldiers and the officials from Kabul left, and then they went back to the ways of the Quran, guarding the livestock of landlords who had fled the country, and reserving grain for the old owners. Anything else was atheism. So war must be waged. Jihad. Long live Islam in Afghanistan. Mujahideen organized across the country. The Quran says, do not accept the orders of the infidels. Wage jihad against them. Even the soldiers of the Kabul government joined. These men are deserters joining a Mujahideen band. Draftees regularly desert from the Afghan army, some bringing their weapons to the resistance. That, say the Mujahideen, is how they get most of their guns, not from the Americans. Desertion has reduced the size of the army of Afghanistan from 80,000 to 30,000 men. It is a difficult war for the Soviets. Here in a television report shown in Moscow, a young Red Army officer was explaining how the Mujahideen attempted to blow up a mountain bridge. They were very professional, he said. They must have been trained somewhere. He was still talking when his men suddenly came under attack. Explained this war back home by calling their enemy Basmachi, bandits. But there is fear and confusion, too. A mother in Moscow was quoted in the press there as saying she feared for her son in the army. What with all those guerrillas with towels over their heads jumping around the mountains? This is a long way from Moscow. People there are not told very much about what's happening here. And they know almost nothing of the way their enemy lives. Mujahideen lives are dictated by the Quran and its laws. This is a trial. This man has been brought before a jirga, a council. He's charged with stealing a pistol from another man in his unit. A serious crime where a man may owe his life to a weapon. There is no question of guilt. He did it. The question is over punishment. The mullah reads from the Quran. The punishment has always been the same for theft. His hand must be cut off. The others argue that he is a good fighter. They can't afford to lose another man. A man with no hand is no man. So there is a compromise. Finally, the thief cries out to Allah. The fighters of the Holy War are untrained, disorganized, undisciplined. They fight with each other almost as often as they fight the Soviets. Some call themselves Democrats. Some look to the Ayatollah Khomeini. There are, depending on the time of year, 20,000 or 100,000 of them in the field. Like all guerrillas, they come and they go. returning to farm, or returning to their families in the safe Islamic haven of Pakistan. The Islamic Republic of Pakistan was the part of northern India set aside as a Muslim country when the British left India in 1947. It has become the 9th largest nation in the world, 85 million people. On a Muslim holiday, these people gather to greet or to plead favors from President Zia in the style of the old Mughal rulers. With his huge army, Zia has imposed order on one of the poorest countries in the world. An unstable nation of 24 languages, 3 wars with India, and 5 military coups in the last 25 years. General Muhammad Zia al-Haq seized power that way, promising elections in 90 days. That was 7 years ago. He has tried to unite the country around the one thing that touches every Pakistani: Islam. Zia is a complicated and subtle geopolitician who has tried to control his people through enforced Islam while using the troubles of Afghanistan to bring in the Americans and billions in American aid.
What the freedom fighters are doing in Afghanistan, inside Afghanistan, is not what affects them directly, but it also affects Pakistan and many other countries. And I go even to the extent of saying that Mujahideen in Afghanistan are fighting not only their battle, but also my battle. Then I think the United States of America should take also pride in the fact that they are also fighting their battle.
Those battles have driven almost 3 million refugees into Pakistan, usually to barren camps like this one north of Peshawar. The United Nations and World Relief Organizations provide more than $1 million a day here for a little canvas, some wheat and cooking oil, a few trucks. The hospitality of the Pakistanis is a wonder, and a danger. The Soviets periodically bomb a camp or two to remind the world that they know these people are going back and forth across the border. Today's refugee is tomorrow's mujahid. The camps are safe haven for the displaced of war and for the fighters of the holy war. It is a very tricky business for Pakistan. More and more Afghans are settling in, and more Pakistanis are concerned that that could mean trouble one day. In cities like the capital, Islamabad, hostility to the refugees is becoming more open, says the editor of the major English-language newspaper, The Muslim.
They are a major burden. They are an economic burden, they are a social burden, and they're now also, I think, becoming a political liability. It is a potential time bomb. And that is why I think the government is keen for some sort of a political compromise to the Soviet Union.
But would these Afghans training here in Pakistan accept a compromise? They fight there, but they may never live in Afghanistan again. The Afghans could become the Palestinians of South Asia, permanent exiles, angry and armed. After 5 years, many Pakistanis are terrified of these people. Some see them as potential shock troops for primitive fundamentalist movements in Pakistan. Most of all, right now, they worry that support of the Mujahideen may invite Soviet attack. President Zia is playing a very risky game.
Pakistan cannot afford to act as a conduit for war in Afghanistan with a very firm and feeble and humble base. That's what we have at the moment. Yes, Pakistan would be too willing to help Afghanistan in any other field, including military, if Pakistan was strong and stable itself. That we are not at the moment.
Zia's country is more exotic than strong, more diverse than stable. Separatist movements have plagued the country since its founding, and one of those movements succeeded, creating the country of Bangladesh from what was once East Pakistan. That led to one of the country's 3 losing wars with India. Hatred and fear of India is one of the many problems of this country. The newest one is drugs. One of the things being traded right here in Peshawar is heroin. Most of the heroin in the United States and Europe comes through Khyber, from poppy fields in Afghanistan. The drugs mean money, which means bribes to authorities. And in Pakistan, authority means the military.
Pakistan, the frontline state, is being sold as the frontier of freedom. But Pakistan isn't free. This is a police state. The British ruled India and Pakistan from walled cantonments, like this one in Peshawar. The best buildings and the best neighborhoods were reserved for the rulers. When the British left, the army of Pakistan moved into the cantonments, and soon enough they were running the country. That army and its chief of staff, Zia-ul-Haq, are now backed and supplied by the United States. American interests on the front line pretty much depend on one man, a military dictator. In many ways, Zia has become the Shah of Iran to us, our new best friend in this part of the world. Will he last longer than the Shah? Does he really speak for the people of Pakistan? Hard to tell. If the people of Pakistan speak out against Zia, they're thrown into jail.
My experience shows you not only need a strong man or men, but you need a very strong and stable structure to govern this country. Because we are in our formative stage of political career, and under such circumstances, irrespective of what people may think abroad, I think in the interest of this country, the governments, the leaders must guide the people. They must lead and must not be led. At the present moment, when you talk of politics in Pakistan, you talk of polarization. People gun for each other's throat.
Polarization here means dissent. The press is among the institutions prevented from criticizing Zia or from investigating the corruption of the military.
What would happen if, day after day, the Muslim began to investigate corruption within the military?
I think that would create certain problems because the military is the only cow in Pakistan.
What problems would it create for you?
I don't think we would be allowed to deal with forbidden areas.
You take a paper of 1977 or any other time, and you take today's paper, any paper, it's of a national press trust, Dawn, Pakistan Times, Now I Work for Young, and you will see visibly how strong or how committed the journalism today is in Pakistan, except for a little check that I have introduced of not reporting any political news in this sense. It is not that I don't want people to play politics, but I don't want people to waste their time. And what politics at the present moment under a military regime, with the parties, with the political parties being practically dormant, then what comes out in the press is not a considered public opinion, but individual whims and thoughts, individual statements which tend to fog the ideas, and that's what we want to avoid.
This is what prevents political activity. The Army routinely jails political leaders who speak or assemble in public. These are the Khyber Rifles, an elite unit, a link to the past, to British India and to the days of Rudyard Kipling. The future seems less romantic. Pakistan is moving toward development of nuclear weapons, the Islamic bomb. That scares the United States about its new friend. Who could Pakistan use the bomb against? Its old enemy, India? Israel? Would U.S. weapons be aimed not at Moscow, but at Delhi?
We always have to deal with the government in power or ignore them, as we have to do in Iran. But when we have a preference, and when we, to the extent that our views have anything to do with it, of course we prefer democratic governments where the people are participating in the process.
The people, however, didn't participate when Zia overthrew and hanged Pakistan's last elected prime minister, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. 2 years later, in November 1979, his army stood by for hours as fundamentalist mobs marched on the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad and then burned it to the ground. But a month later, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. At the same time, American hostages were being held in the embassy in Iran. The U.S. seemed a helpless, friendless superpower in one of the world's strategic corners. Pakistan, Zia, was America's obvious choice, perhaps its only choice.
Well, I think people know very clearly that this America's newly discovered love for Pakistan is just because of its objectives in Afghanistan. And there is a deep resentment against the U.S. in Pakistan for a number of reasons. Firstly, America is perceived as the friend of the enemies of the Muslim world. Secondly, they feel that America wants to use Pakistan as a frontman for its own anti-Sovietism and to keep the Soviets on the map and keep Pakistan sort of up against the Soviets.
We were always interested in Pakistan. We've had ups and downs in our relations, but certainly the fall of the Shah, the withdrawal of the United States from Iran, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan increased the importance of Pakistan and our interest in Pakistan. With the coming in of President Reagan's administration, there's not only an understanding of the situation of Afghanistan, but I think on the Afghanistan issue, there is definitely an identity of views between Pakistan and the United States of America. I don't think I should blow my own trumpet, but we're very proud of our association with the United States of America.
Americans come as pilgrims now to Zia's country, to the refugee camps. National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski.
That land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again. Your cause is right and God is on your side.
The same refugees heard the same message from Secretary of State George Shultz.
And I want you to know that you do not fight alone. Many all over the world stand with you.
And then came Vice President George Bush.
You have earned the admiration of free men everywhere.
There are a lot of purposes served by this war. In Pakistan, they justify a military government in a constant state of emergency because of the refugees. It's a dictatorship here. The Soviet Union may be winning the war by depopulating Afghanistan, by killing enough Afghans and driving enough into Pakistan to take over the land. And the Americans seem content to watch that happen. They cheer on the Afghans a little bit, but really it seems that they want to just embarrass the Soviets. Obviously, there are a lot of games being played here. I was here when Secretary of Shultz was here, and he spoke to the crowd of refugees, and then a Malik spoke to him, a tribal chieftain. After it was over, I asked the Commissioner of Refugees, who was the Malik who spoke? What's his name? Where does he come from? And the Commissioner said, what does it matter? I don't know his name. He's the one who speaks to the Americans. He knows what they like to hear.
The American object seems to be to keep Mujahideen units on the march, like this small group near the city of Kandahar, to give them enough help to harass the Soviet occupiers, but not enough to force the Red Army to retaliate against Pakistan and against American interests. So the weapons come across the mountains in small lots, on the backs of men, carry caravans of men and animals moved back and forth in the high passes, carrying the three essentials of guerrilla warfare: weapons, intelligence, and food. Now and then combining their loads on small trucks. This anti-tank rocket launcher was designed in the Soviet Union and manufactured in China. These landmines are American. The men here are figuring out how to arm the mine by trial and error. They won't know whether these hand grenades are set at 4 or 7 seconds until the first one is actually used. There's no testing here, only combat. The Mujahideen put valor before discretion and before organization. Hundreds of loosely organized bands follow leaders brave and brilliant, foolish and vain. This one is treated as a local saint because he is the son of a cult leader claiming family ties directly to the Prophet Muhammad.
They don't know about the command, you know? What's the meaning of command? What's the meaning of soldier? What's the meaning of fight? I want to fight with Russians. I don't like to fight with Muslim people.
The leaders are like warlords, often turning on each other. Before getting ready to attack a Soviet outpost, these leaders negotiated for hours, dividing up the territory, then signing this treaty. Some fight the Soviets only because they are the latest in a long line of invaders. That does not mean that they are pro-American. Many more think better of the Ayatollah Khomeini than they do of Ronald Reagan. The target on the night of this day will be a small customs house on the edge of Kandahar, a city in the south. A warehouse guarded by soldiers of the Afghan army. It is an easy target and one that promises loot, particularly food, which is as important to guerrillas as ammunition. The Mujahideen waited for sunset. We followed the attack with an electronic night scope camera. The assault was frontal. Nothing fancy. The Mujahideen came through the city streets and began firing. They charged the outer walls. They called on anyone inside to surrender. Instead, a grenade came out, killing one of the raiders. Then the night's prize, cases of cooking oil, exploded. It was not a famous victory. The next morning, the raiders hid from Soviet MiGs, finding cover in an orchard an hour's march south of Kandahar. The MiGs are known to strafe anything that moves, military or civilian, but they're taken for granted now.
History have the Afghans been subjugated. Now clearly they're dealing with a country of several 100 million people with vast military resources. The Soviet Union wants to totally blow the Afghans out of Afghanistan. They have the raw power to do it. And they've been using it recently. The carpet bombing, the tanks surrounding villages, and the elimination of everybody in those villages when they're suspected of having harbored a freedom fighter.
This is scorched earth. The Soviet Union seems willing to destroy Afghanistan to save it for communism. The country is being depopulated. Afghanistan had a population of 15 million in 1979. A third of those people are gone now. 3 million are in Pakistan. More than 1 million may be in Iran. There have been 500,000 casualties, and the infrastructure of the country has been systematically destroyed. Soviet planes dropped small anti-personnel mines on roads and trails. Some are camouflaged, others are made to look like toys or wristwatches.
It's like this man, like watch, like pen, like bird, and like another pen.
The little mines are called butterflies. They don't kill people. The explosion is a small one. They are booby traps. They maim people. This is what drives Afghans to Pakistan. The Soviets are trying to eliminate the support system of the Mujahideen, destroying villages, fields, and the people of the countryside. The results are horrible because there is no medical care in the villages. There are only 200 doctors in the whole country, and because the little mines attract small children.
The Mujahideen exist from the help that they get from the local population. As long as that population exists, the Mujahideen will continue to help. Russians, having discovered this obvious fact, have exerted all their pressures in eliminating that local support for the Mujahideen. So in turn, indirectly, it is directly it is the civilians, but indirectly it is against the Mujahideen as well.
The Soviets may be clearing the way for a new Afghanistan run by cadres of Russian-trained Afghans, but for now, Soviet citizens are firmly in charge, particularly Soviet soldiers. They include these troopers from Soviet Asian republics. But the Russians took no chances with possible Islamic Brotherhood and withdrew men of Muslim heritage early in the war. The revolutionary process in Afghanistan is irreversible. That was said by Soviet leader Brezhnev in 1980. His successors have taken the same pledge. There are now well over 100,000 Red Army men in Afghanistan, with another 50,000 or so operating in the north of the country from bases inside the Soviet Union. The north of Afghanistan is richer than it looks here, in natural gas, in iron ore, and in uranium. And one day it might just become part of the Soviet Union itself. The South would then become a semi-autonomous communist Afghanistan. For now, though, the Red Army is pretty much confined to bases like this one outside Kabul. Morale is low. These are conscripts, paid 3 rubles a month, $4. Drug use has become epidemic. Whatever the grand Soviet strategy, soldiers knew nothing of it. Many were told they were going other places. Some were told they would be fighting Americans. These aren't Americans. Some of them may not even consider themselves Afghans. They're tribesmen, Muslims, Mujahideen. The century may not be important to them either. More than 100 years ago, a foreign minister to the Tsar of Russia said it was necessary to dominate Afghanistan, but it was difficult to know where to stop. The Soviets have not figured out where to stop either, short of killing or exiling every Afghan. And the United States seems intent on cheering on that last Afghan.
We're not willing to fight to the last Afghan. The Afghans are doing the fighting. I mean, that's their decision. They want their own country. They're ready to die for it. They've been dying. And they will continue that struggle as long as they think it is in their interest to serve. Now, it has the advantage that it must be a considerable embarrassment to the Soviet Union. The bear has indigestion in Afghanistan. I mean, a superpower 4.5 years and further from control of the country than they were when they started.
Afghanistan, Mujahideen encounter 3 tanks. They hit one and close in for the kill. There were 4 men in the crew. This is the tank commander. His identity card, a man from Moscow. The Mujahideen rarely take prisoners. A sergeant from Tashkent, land incorporated into the Soviet Union in the 1920s. Their cards and bodies and photographs are scattered now across the land they invaded. The poet of another invader, Rudyard Kipling, wrote this: "When you're wounded and left on Afghanistan's plains, and the women come to cut up your remains, just roll to your rifle and blow out your brains, and go to your God like a soldier." And for their God, Allah, the Mujahideen fight on, fighting to hold back the worlds of the infidels. Poor people, they had 2 things, their land and their God. Their land may be taken from them, the perimeter of contention between giants. So they are left with their faith and their holy war.
Over the past 4 months, there have been several hundred Soviet and Afghan air and artillery attacks on Pakistan territory. Intelligence sources believe the goal is to destroy guerrilla bases and supply lines in Pakistan and increase pressure on President Zia to stop supporting Afghan resistance. A few weeks ago, President Zia told Western journalists Pakistan could not afford a confrontation with Soviet troops. He also said restraint by Pakistan would help in the search for a political solution to the Afghan problem. Leaders of banned political parties in his country, concerned about Soviet pressure, want to go even further. They'd like to see diplomatic recognition of the Afghan regime, improved relations with the Soviets, and the return of 3 million Afghan refugees to Afghanistan. It seems unlikely they will soon go back, or that the Mujahideen will stop their ancient battle against the latest invaders. Next week on Frontline, a look at an urban high school once called Out of Control, which found the means to turn itself around.
It was a school in serious trouble.
When I say I taught it Marshall, they say you got your pistol. Are you afraid to come to work every day? Because it was just that tough.
The school was like the Wild West at that point. An inner-city battlefield tries to turn itself around. Can there be real education after years of neglect?
You can do it.
Mr. and Mrs. Brown, take good care of their house.
The students have come to us in terms of Chicago, the battle, in terms of achievement. And now they can have their minds on learning. Now teachers can teach.
The program is called Marshall High Fights Back. It is next week on Frontline. I'm Judy Woodruff. Good night.
transcript of this program, please send $4 to Frontline, Box 322, Boston, Massachusetts, 02134. Frontline is produced for the Documentary Consortium by WGBH Boston, which is solely responsible for its content. Major funding for Frontline was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Additional funding was provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide. For video cassette information about Frontline, write to PBS Video, Box 8092, Washington, D.C., 20024.